More than any other time in the past, we need to connect ourselves and children with nature and the environment. My name is Kevin O'Shea, and I'm an environmental educator who wants to connect all of you with a bit of inspiration. In each episode of the Nature Talks podcast, I'll talk to incredible educators, scientists, thinkers, and innovators who are connecting those around them to nature and the outdoors and inspiring new generations of environmental stewards. Well, hey there, folks. Welcome back to episode number 13 of the Nature Talks podcast. My name is Kevin O'Shea, and I am the host of this environmental education podcast that helps connect you with change makers who are doing some inspiring things within the world of environmental education, people who are making changes, people who are inspiring students, administrators, educators, parents, anyone out there to help the world and help make it a better place, because that's something we really need. Now, this week, I am super excited to be welcoming to the podcast the host of the American Birding Podcast, Nate Swick. And this is a really cool one for me because I've been listening to the American Birding Podcast. There we go. We're making new words. I've been a big fan of the American Birding Podcast for several years, and I was really excited when Nate agreed to come on the show to talk about a lot of important things about the podcast and about how we can use birds to connect people with nature and a wider world of environmental education. So you know what? Let's just jump right into the podcast. Let's just jump right into the interview with Nate Swick, the host of the American Birding Podcast. Okay, folks. Well, you know what? For this episode, we're really lucky to have a guest coming from far away in the United States. Today, we are fortunate enough to have Nate Swick with us, and he is the voice of the ABA podcast. And if you are not someone who is has their toes and fingers dipped into the world of birds, you may not know what that is. I myself am a big fan of the ABA podcast, American Birding Association podcast. And over the last few years, I've learned a lot about birds, about birding communities, and just a lot of different things through listening to your podcast. Nate, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So you are in the States. Where exactly are you, by the way?
I live in North Carolina, in Greensboro, North Carolina. So in the southeast part of the United States. I am, within my state. I am in what's called the Western Piedmont. It's about an hour and a half from the Southern Appalachian Mountains and a little bit farther away from the coast. It's actually a really nice place to be for a naturalist.
Nice. Yeah, well, I mean, it's yesterday I was chit-chatting with a naturalist who was based here in Shenzhen, China, and the kind of the whole scope of that conversation was talking about urban naturalism and being he's a biologist actually, and about the incredible ecosystems that are in cities, because I mean there's like 16 plus million people here in Shenzhen. It is in many ways an interesting place to be a naturalist as well. Now, I mentioned the ABA podcast, so the American Birding Association podcast. I was wondering if you could maybe tell the listeners a little bit about how you got into the world of birding and how you got to the point where you're hosting this podcast.
Yeah, it's kind of a roundabout journey. It's certainly not one that I would have expected. I started as a naturalist when I was a kid. My dad was a middle school science teacher, and so we were we always had very outdoor heavy childhood. So we lived on a river, spent a lot of time floating the river in our canoe and swimming and catching turtles and snakes and all sorts of bugs and stuff like that. And eventually that interest just sort of translated over to birds. I'm not exactly sure how and when it happened. I suspect it started just because we had field guides lying around our house of all different taxa and a couple different bird field guides. And I just started flipping through those and then making the connection between the birds that I was seeing outdoors every day. And, birds are such an amazing entry to the natural world because they're easy to find. They're all over the place. You can get a really great diversity without working too hard at it. And which makes them different from reptiles and insects. Reptiles are little bit more difficult to find. You have to work a little bit harder.
Yeah.
And insects, there's just so many of them. It's hard to get your mind around identifying them. It's a real stretch. And birds are sort of fit this kind of perfect middle ground, I think, for nature interested kids and nature interested people. And so I got really into it. My dad sort of followed me into it as well. We started going on trips specifically for birds. My grandparents lived in southern Texas, so we'd go down and visit them, and that's one of the great places in the United States to go bird watching. And it just sort of steamrolled from there. And a few years ago, I guess this was close to 15 years ago now, I started just writing online when blogs were sort of a big thing, and I started writing about my birding experiences, and I got involved in a big community of nature writers online. And the ABA was changing leadership at the time, and they were looking for a way to become more online focused. And so I started doing some work for them, just maintaining some of their social media and blog stuff. And then it sort of built over the years into this podcast that we've been doing for 6 years now.
Wow, 6 years. That's incredible. And I mean,
right?
It's really grown. And I can remember, it was a twice monthly kind of thing. And then when COVID hit and the world got shut down and you went to working from home,
everyone went to working else to do.
It came out weekly, which was much to my delight because we were all in lockdown, right?
Right.
But it's interesting, your kind of story there. I mean, I grew up in a household with two birders. My parents were birders. And I think I learned a lot through osmosis just being there. But I wasn't a willing participant. I was...
It's good to know. My kids are not willing participants all the time. So it's good to know that it sticks with you a little bit.
It did. It came back. There was a kind of a boomerang effect. So it was really interesting that, how many times did my mother yell to me, Kevin, come here to the back window and take a look. There's a bunch of juncos out there feeding, or look, there's a bunch of, look at the nuthatches on the suet, and making suet balls and like being made to. And it was kind of something I resented until, I became a teacher. And then my late 20s, early 30s, all of a sudden I got interested in it. And for me, it was moving to Japan.
That a lot of people have.
Yeah. And so the podcast, one thing I wanted to touch on is when we look at this podcast, and it's something that you've mentioned, I know, in the podcast with different guests over the years, is what people think of the face of birding, or what you think of birding. Now, when I started kind of getting into, and I'm still not sure if I would call myself a birder. I'm more of a naturalist. I'm a bug guy. But I do really appreciate the birds. I love birds. I find they're such a fantastic way to connect kids with the outdoors. But I can remember that I was living in Japan and teaching in Japan, and my kind of birding senpai, I guess, was an Australian guy who was just a couple of years older than me, and we were both in our 30s, and we just looked so out of place when we would go anywhere. He was actually had a master's in ornithology, and we both worked at the same international school. And he was also like a black belt in judo and jujitsu. So he was this like muscular, stocky guy who would often like have a tank top on, and he had tattoos.
Yeah, right.
And he'd have like the binoculars around his neck and the camera strapped on, and we would go places. And I would say that the average age of a birder was probably in their 60s, mid 60s to older. And there are these two very clearly non-Japanese men who were in their 30s would come along, and it caused a commotion almost. So, one thing when I look at the American Birding Podcast, or I listen to a lot of the guests who've been on in recent years, and I see like profiles on the page, it really does kind of look like, at least from that perspective, that the face of birding is starting to change.
And I think it is a little bit, at least. There's still, a large group of people that are retired and come to birding because they're looking for something to do in their retirement, and birding's such a great activity to keep your mind and body active. And that's certainly a great part of it. But there's a lot of people who have started younger and or have come back to it when they're a little bit older, and their family, starting a family and looking for something to do with their families. There's just a lot of wider distribution of ages and types of people that are into birding these days. And that's absolutely true. That's absolutely happening. When I think back to my own childhood as a birder, I was the only teenage birder effectively in my state. And, the bird club that I was a part of, which was, just super great for, one of the nice things about birding is that even a young teenager can contribute to this community in a really substantive way. And and essentially be treated as an equal and not as a kid. That group still had a lot of older people in it, people that are still, some of them are still around.
Yeah.
And when I look at the birding community now, there are a lot more people like I was then who are communicating with each other and building communities and sort of, diversifying the birding community in a lot of different ways. Yeah. And it's definitely happening. And I don't know what it is. I don't know whether the culture has sort of changed. There's definitely in the last 20 years been sort of a movement to sort of embrace your geekery. I think it's become a lot cooler to be interested in these sort of niche subjects, be they comic books or video games or birds and nature. This sort of thing has become more acceptable. And when you're a teenager, that means a lot. When I was a young teenage birder, it was not very cool to be a birder. And because I didn't have that sort of social connections with people of my own age, I kind of drifted away for a little bit before coming back to it in my late 20s. And I just see people not doing that as much anymore. Like it's become socially acceptable, I guess.
Yeah.
Person, and that's great. It's great.
Yeah. I was thinking like one of the things, like last year I started getting into beekeeping. We here at my school, we had a teacher who started at our school who was from England and a very passionate, enthusiastic beekeeper with a lot of experience. And he had started in his middle school in England, and here he is in China. And he was able to get some beehives on the roof of our school. He started teaching us and training other teachers, and he created a beekeeping club for the high school. And one of the things I've noticed is I like surf around Instagram, and I've got my Instagram feed of like natural stuff. Like there's like this whole like kind of like not even a subculture of like hip young beekeepers.
Yeah, I know it's weird. My teenage self would not have believed it.
Yeah. Who are like good-looking, stylish beekeepers who have like hundreds of thousands of followers.
Yeah. I don't know. I really do think it's a big cultural shift to people kind of being encouraged to follow their hearts in a way that maybe was less likely in the 80s and 90s when conformity was perhaps more the ideal. I think it's great. I think people are going to find what moves them in whatever sort of way, and stick with it and become members of our community. And birding has this already has this sort of culture of community that's such a huge part of it. Information sharing, mentorship, all this stuff has always been really important to the birding community, and it's neat to see that become popularized, I guess. Really lean into this stuff, and it's really gratifying to see it for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, that's one of the things is I teach young children, and one of the things that I've done in the schools I've worked at in Japan and in Beijing, I was up there for a while. I would have an after school activity like with birds, a birding ASA as we called it. And the kids just loved it. And and they were so excited. And one thing, it's really funny to say, but like I always say, if you want to be like the cool teacher at a primary school, be the bug bird guy. If you're the bug bird guy, you're the rock star. Exactly. Like you're walking in the hall and there's kids just screaming your name. Like, you go to an assembly with a mantis on your hand or some kind of giant beetle, and they're just like, ah.
I have a big bug collection that I've collected over the years, and there was a while before the pandemic when I would go in to my kids' school and just give a short talk about bugs, and I have some cool specimens that they really dug, and you talk about cool adaptations and evolution and all sorts of really neat things that insects are such wonderful examples of these things, and the kids would love it, and hopefully you can kind of change perceptions about stinging insects and stuff like that. Oh, wasps are cool. They were all really neat stuff. And exactly. And the kids love it. And there are kids that my son is in middle school now, and there are some of his friends that still remember me from third grade. As the bug guy.
That's cool. That's the geek flag you want to wave.
I'll wear it.
Yeah. So, and on this theme of connecting kids with the outdoors, I mean, you wrote a book, you've written a few books actually, but one book in particular that kind of fits really well into this kind of theme of teaching children about the outdoors or connecting kids with the outdoors is your Birding for the Curious, the easiest way for anyone to explore the incredible world of birds. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that book and kind of, I mean, I think we kind of already have an idea of what inspired you to write it, but if you could tell us a little bit about kind of the process there and why you put that book together.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I sort of fell into it.
Oh, okay.
I was doing some writing for the 10,000 Birds website, and which Mike Bergen and Corey Finger there do a fantastic job. It's one of the more popular birding websites, birding blogs on the internet. So they had been contacted by a publishing company who wanted sort of a how-to book on birds, and they had kind of worked around with them, and I don't know, they didn't see eye to eye for whatever reason, and they sort of kicked it to me and are like, "Hey Nate, can you take a crack at this idea?" And I was like, "All right, yeah, sure. I'll try and synthesize my birding career into this book that might help people kind of follow the same path that I did." And it was really fun. It was nice to be able to kind of think about things in that, you internalize your own sort of process and your own sort of journey. And it's really a useful exercise to be able to kind of come from the outside and try and explain it in a way that is going to resonate with someone else. How I bird, how I go about identifying birds around me, how I approach bird watching as an avocation. I hadn't really given that stuff a ton of thought. But for the book, I sort of had to. That was the whole idea with it. And also the publisher came with the idea of ending every chapter with sort of an activity, which is sort of nice. So I think, all right, so what did you learn here? How can you put this stuff into practice? Which was slightly different than a lot of other kind of birding how-to books that have been out there. It was fun to write. It was fun to work with the Page Street Publishing on this, and it led to the field guide that I did the next year, the ABA field guide to the birds of the Carolinas. I feel like I sort of got lucky in it. I mean, It wasn't anything that I had simmering on my idea, but it was simmering in my brain for a long period of time. Yeah. But it was something that I found a really useful exercise to kind of to talk about how I bird and why I bird. And yeah, you mentioned that it's good for elementary kids. That's great. I envision that book being something in a school library or a public library, something that someone can pick up. It's hard copy, hardback. It's actually really nicely put together. And people can pass it down to whoever is sort of getting the birding bug, I guess, for lack of however you want to approach that. But I hear from people all the time that say that they found it really useful, and that's always great. I know there's a lot of other books out there that sort of approach the same topic, but sometimes you just need the certain someone to explain it in the way that makes sense to you. And I'm glad to be that for some people. Yeah. No. It's interesting. Like, I'm currently studying environmental education. Mm-hmm. I've been passionate about connecting kids with the outdoors for a long time. Yeah. And one of the things that I found is that in all the buildings I've worked, a lot of it's got to start with the teachers. You got to start connecting teachers to the outdoors. And that's a constant theme that I hear when I take courses. And I'm, here I am in China. I'm a Canadian in China. I'm taking a course, distance learning. I'm taking different courses through university in Canada. And I'm, all of my classmates are professional teachers working in Canada who are doing a lot of really inspirational enviro ed stuff already. And that's that constant theme. It's about how I'm the only one in this building who's passionate about this or who wants to get the kids involved. So I think for us as educators, a lot of it too is also leading by example and showing how cool that is to other teachers and pushing the power of getting them outdoors. Like that's that theme that I hear from a lot of the people who do what I do is you've got to encourage those around you to think the same way. And when I think about people who have told me their sort of paths into birding, it's so many of them. It's like the one passionate teacher who kind of lit the spark. And it's just a matter of, sometimes it's just fortuitousness that these two people are together in this place and time, and that spark gets kind of passed on to the next person. But I feel exactly the same way. I've done more informal environmental education, and the stuff that you are interested in is the stuff that the kids get interested in, even if it's for a relatively short period of time. Every once in a while, there's a kid that's going to take it on beyond that. They don't always, but you're always kind of searching for that one or two kids that really hit it in the way that maybe you did. But as long as you're interested in something and really expressing that interest, I've found that kids are going to follow you.
Yeah. That's it. They see the passion, they see the excitement.
Yeah.
And I found that not only kids, but other teachers see that.
Yeah.
And
for sure.
and other people. And that's an interesting thing. Like bringing it back to your podcast, the ABA podcast. I mean, again, I've been listening for years. And, it's hard to find good podcasts on the topics you're into, there's, for example, if I'm into gardening as well, and how many gardening podcasts that I go to Apple Podcasts and I download an episode. I'm like, no, move on.
Yeah. It's not working.
Download an episode. Yeah. No, that's not working for me. That's not working for me.
Yeah.
And for me right now, like I'm really into the Joe Gardner podcast. The guy's name is Joe Lampel. He's a host. It's based out of the States, and that works for me. He's great. He's awesome. I made that connection with that podcaster. And also like with your podcast, I think what I found refreshing is cool. Is just hearing these like different people, like the Birdist.
And Nick's great.
Is that right? And there's just and there's a lot of really cool people who come on who have really neat perspectives. And I hear of, I can remember during the pandemic, I'm not sure, was that his group, the Google Street View birding one?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I can remember like I took some time doing that where I'd be like, that's a great idea on like a Friday night. Like I'm sitting at home, my kids have gone to bed, I got a beer. I'm like, here.
Let's see what we can find. Let's go to a cool place and see if we can scroll around. Yeah,
exactly. So, I'm not, as your podcast, you said it's been 6 years now, and I'm wondering, as time goes on, have you seen, obviously I'm sure it's grown quite a bit, but what kind of changes or, with regards to the evolution of your podcast, what are some of the kind of more notable changes you've seen or?
When we started doing it, essentially, I didn't really have much of a plan. So when we started our podcast, there weren't that many birding podcasts out there. There were a handful of them. Sharon Steitler, Bird Chick, did one.
Yeah,
the late Phil Thompson III had a podcast.
Yeah.
They didn't hit me for whatever reason. Like I really like those people as people, and hung out with Sharon a few times and Bill as well. And they're great. There was something missing about that podcast that kind of kept it from hitting the way I wanted it to.
Yeah.
And essentially when I went into making the American Birding Podcast, I was like, I'm going to make a podcast that I want to listen to.
Yeah.
And it's going to cover the topics that are interesting to me. Because that's going to be the sort of thing I'm going to be able to sustain for the long haul. And, I'm glad that so many other people got it too. We certainly have seen the podcast grow. We are, the listenership is as high as it's ever been. I'm still fortunate that the people who do the This Month in Birding panel with me still want to continue to talk birds with me, and get something out of it as well. It becomes sort of a self-fulfilling vehicle at some point because, you do these interviews with people and that leads to other people, and then people will contact you and say, hey, I've got some ideas. And then once you get that kind of process rolling, it becomes a lot easier to sustain because it's less work. Even though we're putting out more content than we ever have. I've kind of gone down a tangent here. Could you repeat what your question?
Yeah. No, well, I mean, that's right there. Like you said, I think
how have we changed? Yeah.
No, but I think that you've summed it up very well. I mean, it started off as something, we all, we start a podcast that we want to listen to. I've said that before. I've had other shows before that were completely unrelated to this topic. I lived in Japan for years, and I had a podcast just about Japan stuff. And the reason why I created that was because I couldn't find any podcasts that were good. And I don't really want to listen to myself talk, but I wanted to podcast. So I said, let's make a podcast that I would want to hear. And at the time I liked long form podcasts. And I knew that I couldn't sustain it by just being me talking, I'd get like 2 or 3 episodes and I'd be done. So I needed to bring people on. And through that podcast, I met some really cool, fantastic people who, led me to, I guess I got my appetite wet for podcasting.
No, I know exactly how that is. And I'm really gratified to see all the podcasts that have come out of not necessarily out of us, but in the wake of American Birding Podcast And there are a lot more birding podcasts out there. There's some really great ones. Life List with Alvaro and George Armistead is very good, and Molly, who's on our podcast every once in a while. Actually, George and Alvaro have been guests on the American Birding Podcast in the past. We're all friends. We all know each other. We're all part of the same community. I'm very much of the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats. There's so much content out there, and I hope that people enjoy all of it. And and that's great. I would encourage people to check out other podcasts. The Hen and Eric Go Birding, another really good one. There's a lot of good stuff out there that for birders.
There's not as active as once was, but the Bird SHIT podcast.
Moen.
That was a fun one.
Yep.
That's a fun one. But okay, so I mean that kind of leads me into what I wanted to ask you, next, and I'll wrap this up. I don't want to keep you too long.
Sure.
But as far as kind of advice from educators or advice for educators out there, how would you say maybe a podcast like yours, a podcast like the other ones you talk about, how would you say those kind of inspire people? Because you've already said that other podcasts have come from yours. And I know what you mean, not legitimately, maybe not affiliated with the ABA podcast, but people have heard yours and were inspired to make their own.
Exactly.
They're like, wow, like he can do this, I could do this. Or they realize, podcasting.
If I can do it, anyone can do it.
Podcasting's not as daunting as it once was. You need a microphone and a laptop and boom. And not even that sometimes, just your iPhone. And, so how would you say that like podcasting, for example, can inspire people, educate people, help teachers to kind of share the word of conservation, of biodiversity, all those kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think educators are always, you get a lot out of interacting with other people who are sort of doing the same thing that they're doing. That's why conferences are so useful. Podcasts are essentially like a consortium, I guess, a weekly consortium that you can get ideas from and share passion. And it's always useful to listen to people who are as interested in things, no matter what that topic is, as you are, and it sort of keeps your interest rolling. If you lose that for whatever reason, if you're isolated for whatever reason, it's easy for those interests to kind of fade away. I know it happened with me when I was a young birder, just not having people of my own age to bird around, and caused me to kind of, go away from birding for a little while before coming back. Just interacting with people who are as passionate about this thing as you are, can kind of keep that interest going. And, any opportunity you can get more ideas of things to teach, things to talk about, people to interact with, people to contact to get information on. The Skype a scientist is a big thing in science classrooms. I think, you can get in contact with scientists and expose the kids to the work that they're doing. Any of that stuff is great and is going to, keep you motivated to keep pushing forward. I think it's all about just feeling like you're part of this bigger community of educators that is all kind of pulling in the same direction. Be it in nature, be it in whatever your subject is, just feeling like you're in that group as opposed to kind of pulling on your own, which can get wearing, get exhausting.
I think too, like one of the things I've learned from podcasting and just from being a teacher, and the one thing, like a piece of advice I'd give to teachers, is that when you want to have that scientist come in or that expert, all you normally have to do is just ask. And
yeah, it's true. And a lot of people are ready to talk about the things that they're passionate about.
Exactly.
And happy to do so.
Yeah. I can remember a few years ago when I was living in Beijing, there was an event called Birds and Beers. And I went to that and I met a lot of cool people, and most of them were scientists and conservationists and wildlife rehabbers and stuff. And I can remember meeting some of these scientists who worked at universities. And when they found out what I did, they're like, "You're a second grade teacher?" Like all of a sudden they're like, "You're the one." They're like,
about the age when people find their.
And they're like, we want to get our message, our knowledge to the people that you're teaching. And just through that one event, I was able to get a couple of names and a couple of people that were happy to come to my school and talk to a few classes. And that was really neat. You know what? Well, we can wrap things up. I really appreciate you sharing your experiences and knowledge with us. And again, this is really cool for me. I've been listening to your show for years. And I appreciate it. And I think what what I find cool is hearing other birders who are, I mean, I'm not so young, but I'm not so old either. So hearing that, it's again, it's something I came to again and later in life. I guess I don't know if I ever was in it before. I've got lots of stories of my parents throwing me into the back of a car and driving all around Eastern Canada. And there were always bird guides stuffed into every crevice and orifice of the car. And
well, I'm glad to know that because, my own kids have experienced that as well. And who knows, you plant the seed and you never know where and how it's going to take root. I just kind of got to hope for the best to some extent.
That's the same. I have two kids. I've got a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old. And, they're not at the moment, I wouldn't say they're following in my footsteps. But what's really cool is that, like, when we're walking down the road and if you hear the sound of an oriental magpie robin calling or a red-whiskered bulbul, my 12-year-old knows by ear. Yeah. He's like, "Hey, Dad, is that a bulbul?" I'm like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Nice one."
Got it. Yep. Stuck there.
And my 9-year-old daughter has no problem if she sees like a giant stag beetle on a tree of just pulling it off and putting it on her arm. Yeah. Like, "Look, Dad."
Hey, you never know. You never know what's going to happen.
You never know.
All you got to do is give it to them and see where it goes from there.
Yeah, exactly.
Same with any school children. Yeah.
Cool. So if folks want to find you online, and I hope they do, those who are listening, where can they find the American Birding Podcast and the different things that you do?
The American Birding Podcast is available wherever people find podcasts. I've tried to cast that net widely. So wherever, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all of them, all the places.
Yeah.
You can find us online. ABA is at aba.org. You can get us on social media. Twitter is a great place. At ABA, at N8Swick, where you can find us. And just keep an eye out. We're all over the place.
Cool. And all those links will be in the show notes, folks, and they'll be on the Facebook page and all those cool places. Well, Nate, thank you so much for coming by and talking to the Nature Talks podcast.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thanks so much.
Now, I want to really give a huge thank you to Nate for coming on the podcast. I've been a fan of the American Birding Podcast for a long time and really excited for Nate Swick to come on and share his knowledge, his experiences with us. Again, thank you so much, Nate, for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us here on the Nature Talks podcast. Now, of course, you can listen to the American Birding Podcast over at aba.org or anywhere you download podcasts. You can also follow Nate on Twitter at Nate Swick. That is capital N, the number 8, the digit, and Swick, Swick. Wow. And all of you out there, thank you so much for joining us again for another episode of the podcast. I'm really thankful for all the people who have come on over to our new Facebook page. Join our community. That's where we talk. That's where we converse about things environmental education over at facebook.com/Nature Talks Podcast. Again, go over there and join the conversation. I want to thank all the people who have come over and followed me on Twitter from this podcast. I'm a very active Twitter user over at Mad for Maple. So I'm at Mad for Maple on Twitter. And we do have an Instagram over at Shizen Wildlife. Shizen Wildlife, that's SHIZEN Wildlife. And yeah, so that's it for all the places that you can find us. Of course, I'm so happy that Nate came on the podcast. I kind of grew up in a way with birds. I was not a birder, as I mentioned in the podcast growing up, but my parents were. So I was that kind of reluctant person who went along on birding excursions. My parents would throw my older brother and I into the car, and I am a child of the 80s. And they would cart us around Eastern Canada to look up birds. I don't know how much of those birds I was really interested in at the time. Probably not a lot. But I did learn a lot about birds through osmosis. Many times my mom turning off the TV or getting in the way of the TV to bring me over to the window and look at our backyard bird feeder to look at different types of things of Bohemian waxwings and cedar waxwings and all of those good things. And later in life, my mother and father, my mother actually wrote a column for a very small local newspaper, almost zine, called the Lewisburg Seagull. And I can remember local people in town would love to have their names printed in the Lewisburg Seagull to share their rare bird alerts and the different locations and types of birds they would cite. And I can remember around supper time each night, when I was probably 8, 9, 10 years old, lots of people would be calling our house to talk to my mom, and my mom would be really excited getting out her notepad and writing down these different bird sightings and rare bird alerts, and then putting them into this monthly newsletter called the Lewisburg Seagull. And I believe the name of her article was For the Birds by Helen O'Shea. And it was a very popular, I think it was one of the most highly anticipated reads of the month in the Lewisburg Seagull, our community of about 1,000 people in Nova Scotia, Canada, as people would sit by with fevered anticipation, hoping to see their names appearing in this small publication. But those are memories I have. As I sit back on it now as a middle-aged adult and a parent and an educator, I do really appreciate the contact I had with other birders, the experiences I had with birders as parents. And so there we go. And now I'm a naturalist. So things all come around in full circle, I suppose. Again, thank you, everyone, for following the podcast. Please help us grow. If you're listening to us in a place like Apple Podcasts, please leave an amazing review and a 5-star rating, of course, no matter where you listen to our podcast. And spread the word. Help us grow. Share this podcast on your social media, on your Facebook, on your Twitter. If you're a teacher and educator, you're probably on some LinkedIn groups, some Facebook groups. Please share the links I post of this podcast and help the Nature Talks podcast grow bigger and bigger. It's a grassroots movement. Each and every one of you can make a really big difference if you share this on your social media. So there we go. That is it for another episode of the podcast, episode number 13. I just want to let you know that next week I'll have a dark week for the podcast. There will not be an episode next week. Right now I'm in the middle of my first week of school for the school year, the 2022-23 school year. So things are a bit, all over the place. You know how it is. So next week I'll be just kind of regrouping and getting things back on track. So episode 14 will come out the week after next. So again, next week will be a dark week for the podcast, but don't worry. There's nothing wrong going on. Lots of fantastic interviews for you coming really soon. All right, that's it. Again, my name is Kevin O'Shea. I'm a Canadian early years and environmental educator based in Shenzhen, China. And wherever you are in the world, I hope you're happy. I hope you're healthy. And we will be talking to you again very soon.